And for more international extraditions, Attorney Douglas McNabb is talking to us from Washington, D.C. about all the legal issues in this case. Doug, very good to see you. So, Assange's lawyers have pretty much said that if he is extradited to Sweden, he could then be sent to Gitmo or even executed here in the United States. How likely are either of those scenarios to turn into reality?
Well, I don't think the issue involving being detained in Gitmo is a real issue. With regard to potentially facing the death penalty, of course, it would depend upon two things. One, if Mr. Assange were charged with an offense that potentially carried the death penalty, then that's on the table. However, I, from a practical standpoint, don't see Sweden or any other European country agreeing to an extradition of Mr. Assange to the U.S. without an assurance from the U.S. government that Mr. Assange would not be facing the death penalty.
All right, so what would the legal strategy be on the part of the United States to actually get him here in the first place?
Well, first of all, it takes a criminal charge brought by the U.S. government, I believe, out of Alexandria, Virginia, which is the eastern district of Virginia, which is the same location that Moussaoui, the bomber, was indicted out of. If the U.S. government indicts Mr. Assange, then depending upon whether Mr. Assange is in the U.K. or Sweden, then they would seek to have him extradited from either one of the two countries. From a U.S. perspective, it is easier under the terms of the extradition agreement between U.K. and U.S. for the U.S. to have Mr. Assange extradited. On the other hand, there is a provision in the supplemental treaty between Sweden and the United States that Sweden could agree to, quote, temporarily transfer Mr. Assange to the U.S. to stand trial in the U.S. on U.S. charges, and then at the conclusion of that proceeding that he would be transferred back to Sweden based upon mutual agreement of the parties. My reading of that provision of the supplemental treaty is that the U.S. could hold on to Mr. Assange if he is convicted in the U.S. of the charges lodged against him, and Mr. Assange does his jail time in the U.S., which could be significant jail time, and then afterwards transferred back to Sweden. All, again, legal under the terms of the extradition and supplemental treaty between Sweden and the U.S.
But what do you think will ultimately happen with this case, given your knowledge and experience about all these things?
It's hard to tell because politics, unfortunately, is having a play in this case between U.S. and U.K., and I think potentially between U.K. and Sweden and the U.S. There is the arrest warrant was based upon the European arrest warrant, which provides for an expedited extradition process among the EU countries, so that this matter is supposed to be expedited. However, there is an extradition treaty between the U.S. and U.K., which also is an expedited process, particularly from U.K. to the U.S., not necessarily from the U.S. to U.K. So it's hard to tell how this is ultimately going to turn out.
Now, speaking of politics, we just saw a piece that pointed out the connection between Karl Rove and the Swedish government, the Prime Minister more specifically. How could that influence the chain of events, if at all?
Well, we would have to see, let's assume hypothetically that Mr. Assange loses his extradition hearing in the UK and is rendered, he is extradited to Sweden. Then the U.S. steps forward with an indictment and says, Sweden, we'd like to have Mr. Assange sent to the U.S. to stand trial in the U.S. Now, that process is supposed to be wholly within the legal process, the extradition hearing. The Swedish political process could come into play, I'm trying to say this delicately, could come into play and could have an impact on whether Mr. Assange is actually tried in Sweden for the offenses of which he was extradited, or perhaps after trial, depending upon, regardless of whether he won or he lost, Mr. Assange could then be temporarily returned to the U.S. to stand trial in the U.S. and certainly the political process. It's not supposed to be, but potentially could come into play at that point.
So you're painting different scenarios for us. But, Doug, let's talk about Bradley Manning, because you've questioned whether or not the UK would protect Manning. Talk a little bit more about that. This is not an argument or question that we hear very often. Just very briefly wanted to get your thoughts on that.
Well, with regard to that process, I mean, the politics does come into play, and that is an issue that we could see in this instance as well.
Douglas McNabb, thank you so much for your analysis. Obviously, this is such a complicated case. Like you said, politics always at play, but we will continue to follow it very closely. Thank you.
My pleasure. Thank you.